Hello, my name is Olu Osha. I like to talk about American presidents, and I'm continuing my discussion about our 42nd President's Welfare Reform Act, which was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. Um, as I said, I'm going to discuss the features and its consequences later on, but I want to quickly start by just giving the history of entitlement programs and welfare. When I say entitlement programs, uh, welfare, for instance, welfare programs are entitlement programs. Entitlement programs are the programs to which U.S. citizens have a legal right, and they require mandatory spending by government, and therefore people who meet eligibility requirements. So they include Social Security. Now, Social Security Act first came into being after the Great Depression era, and it was passed, made law by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? And so our first major welfare program, the entitlement program, uh, was called the Aid to Families with Dependent Children. This was signed into law by FDR, that's Franklin D. Roosevelt, in 1935. And of course, this was to address the ills of the Great Depression that started from 1929 with the stock market crash. Now, and this was the first major government involvement in welfare programs. But it wasn't consistent with our Constitution. You have to remember, in the preamble of our Constitution, it actually says, the government, the purpose of the government of our union was also to promote the general welfare of the people, of American citizens, to secure, the blessings of liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and prosperity. So these welfare programs, these entitlement programs, they're consistent with supporting Americans. But of course, at the time our Constitution was first written, Constitution of 1787, it's been amendment subsequently. We have to remember that a huge segment of the population, that's the black population, the African descendants, they were enslaved, right? They were enslaved persons, and they were property. We've since fought a war. We fought a war over it in, the middle of the 19th century, and we subsequently had Reconstruction amendments, Reconstruction era amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, which, and their purpose was to abolish slavery and make people of African descent, African Americans, equal citizens. But since then, we've all constantly had this pushback by Southern whites. And you can see this in the welfare programs, right? Because from the beginning of our nation, there's been this sort of welfare, right? There's been this sort of welfare that white people have had access to. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln passed the Homestead Act. It actually provided free homes, free houses for any white person who's just willing to move westward, right? And take up land and live there, develop the land. He didn't have to pay anything. It was free to them. There's so many other programs like that. I've given other people, I've given white Americans, boots, laces, so they can lift up themselves by their boots, by their bootstraps. But you have to remember that Africans, descendants of slaves, they had nothing. With the abolition of slavery, they didn't receive 40 acres and a mule. They didn't receive reparations. They didn't receive anything, and so they're often very hard hit, by things that by when there's a national disaster, right? Like a depression, the Great Depression that occurred, in following the stock market crash of 1929. The Republican Party was not in favor of due to their classical uh, era economics that free market forces should prevail. They were not in support of federal intervention and provision of social safety nets and relief and humanitarian efforts. And this was a national disaster. FDR and the Democrats changed that in the 1930s with the aid to uh, you know to families with dependent children. So that was basically welfare, and it was a federally funded program. It was administered by the federal government. But over time, this took on racial tones, right? It took on racial tones, and it was infamously exploited and abused by President Ronald Reagan in the 70s during his presidential campaign when he invoked the imagery, the misrepresented, hackneyed imagery of the welfare queen as being a black woman who was exploiting American taxpayers with numerous children. She had false aliases in order to milk the American people and buy Cadillacs, buy mink coats and things like that, living a lavish lifestyle, not wanting to work, just a grifter. Uh, it turns out the woman in question. I saw a PBS video, a documentary on the woman in question. Her name was Linda Taylor. Linda Taylor, they actually described her as something of a racial chameleon, or being racially ambiguous. Sorry, there are bugs out here. As I've often said, I'm actually sitting in front of a garden, so there are bugs all around me. Uh, so they're itching. Um, Not bed bugs. So anyway, um, Linda Taylor was someone from the South, and even though she lived in a white family, but you remember during the era of slavery and Jim Crow, there was something called the one drop rule. So uh, it didn't follow science, right? It didn't follow science because in science, if you have a white mother or white father, you know, you're equally both, because you have all the 23 chromosomes of the white person, 23 chromosomes of the black person, right? And so you have both of them. Some genes are dormant and not. But in America, once you have any mixture, right, you take the identity uh, of the group that's stigmatized. That's a black person, right? So if a black person mixes with a white person, they're automatically black and not identified as white. So Linda Taylor was someone who was actually mixed race, and apparently she had more white in her. She was an octoroon. But because of the stigma, she couldn't live with her white family, and so she was passing. She was somebody who was mixed race who was passing. There are many people like that. Like I said, genes sometimes it can come out in certain ways, and people who are racially mixed, there have been instances where somebody who has mixed parents, mixed ancestry, they can just turn out completely white or completely black. She came out looking more white. All she had to do to look black was change her wig. If you wore a wig, Afro wig, she looked like a black person. So sometimes, in fact, on her registration cards, she identification cards, sometimes she passed as black, sometimes she passed as white, as Hispanic. So she was racially ambiguous, but she was termed black by uh, uh, Ronald Reagan, and he used it as a racial dog whistle to caricature, stigmatize black people, so he could galvanize, white people, especially the racists amongst them, to, you know, to, to attack welfare programs, right? And the more developed you are as a nation, right? The more developed you are as a nation, the more you show compassion, and the more you are educated, informed, enlightened enough to see that you can either make your people, your citizens, assets, or liabilities, right? If you take care of your citizens, they end up taking care of you. They can pay taxes and things like that. Wealthy people have their parents' welfare, right? I was born to a bank CEO and a bank chairman, right? He was my welfare. He was my security, who was able to provide me uh, quality education, quality housing where I lived, and everything, and security, so that I could become independent and be a productive citizen anywhere I go to. I'm an American citizen. I'm productive in America. I'm going to get into how, right? There have been policies by racist, reactionary governments to disenfranchise black people and to bar them, create obstacles from being able to secure the blessings of liberty, pursuit of happiness, and promote the general welfare. I'm not a welfare case. I'm a black person. I've never received welfare in America. I've never received food stamps. I've never received any benefit. But the thing is, I will not disparage people who are less fortunate, who need it. I've been unemployed due to a racist, corrupt judge in Maryland for 3 years who locked me up for over 9 months. I'm an innocent man. I haven't had a day of trial. I haven't had a trial. But I know the reason why I'm pointing this out is because I know the abuses and the atrocities that black people, especially black men, are burdened with in many racist white states in America. Southern states and racist southern states like the state of Maryland in America, because many of these states we still have reactionary people, like reactionary judges, corrupt government officials, corrupt cops, like in Maryland, where black men are still being targeted, disenfranchised. My property was stolen by the cops in Montgomery County, Maryland, in my own home, and they've denied taking it. It was destroyed and stolen. So I can imagine when people are talking about, wow, that blacks are targeted and they're whites who just go wholesale when they see blacks progressing and they destroy their communities. It could have been black American cops who actually destroyed and stole my property, because racism, abused people become envious and bitter and they become destructive as well, right? So they could have been envious of the little I had because they feel they're victims of oppression as well. But anyway, I digress. Let's go into the actual policies. But I want to be able to practicalize these ideas and policies and how they translate to life events, real life events. And I have my own life, right, to be able to use for analysis, right? So let's go back to the evolution of welfare, right? So FDR starts aid to families with dependent children, right? Welfare. It is an entitlement program. I explained what entitlement is. You have it as a legal right. So long as you meet eligibility criteria, Congress has to provide funding for it because it's consistent with the goals of our Constitution to promote the general welfare of the people, right? So this was the situation. It never changed. It was enhanced, right? It was supplemented, augmented under Lyndon B. Johnson, our 36th president, in his Great Society programs, right? He showed great compassion and he tried to end poverty. There were great programs, Job Corps. He created food stamps, which is known as SNAP today. That's supplemental nutrition assistance program. SNAP, where low-income people, can receive aid, to get groceries. So there's so many of these programs, and these things were altered following the dog whistle of many of the Republicans, right, who were saying, well, this is just a welfare kings, black women who are just milking the system. They don't want to work. They're abusing the system. They're crooks and all that stuff. I've already stated earlier, Studies have shown that black people are not the biggest recipients of welfare. Welfare, the delivery or distribution, actually is proportional to the demographic distribution we have in America, right? 43% from most recent studies, 43% of all welfare recipients are white people. That's the largest, 43%. The next, 26% are Hispanic people. After that are black people, 23%. Below that, Asian Americans, 8%, right? So black people are not the biggest recipients of welfare, right? But this has been misrepresented with the welfare queen thing, the woman who was actually racially ambiguous, who was a con artist, and she was dealing with her own issues. She had mental health issues, uh, that's an outlier. That's an outlier, and she was projected, misrepresented to characterize all black people, right? In any event, Bill Clinton, when he was running his campaign in 1992, he ran with this Republican dog whistle to be able to attract votes. I suppose, because so he said he was going to end welfare as we know it, because remember, the Democrats had become the civil rights and social justice party. But now here was Bill Clinton from the Democratic Party, but in the South, and he was now aligning his platform uh, with checking welfare, what Republicans were advocating, which was part of the Republicans' neoliberal policies, their platform. So Bill Clinton passes the uh, Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in 1996. It had salient features which included a work requirement that recipients had to work. They had to be doing some kind of work or job-related activities, right? Job-related activities could include volunteering, and I'm going to address this later on. So they had to now work to receive welfare, to receive any sort of aid, and then instead of the aid to families, with dependent children was now replaced with what was called temporary assistance for needy families, and this now it was temporary assistance. It was now capped over a lifetime for 5 years. You couldn't receive it for more than 5 years, and the other thing is, it now required a certain percentage of the total caseload of recipients to be working. It now required work. The other thing is where the welfare was an entitlement program, right? You were entitled to it. That meant you didn't need to, so long as you were eligible, you didn't need to do anything to get it. It was your right. It was a legal right. It was no longer an entitlement program, and it was taken away from the federal government. It was still going to be federal government funding, but it was now it was now a program that the federal government now relinquished control and its administration to the states, right? So it was now the states who had control, individual states. So instead of having one uniform program that was run by the federal government, you could now we have 50 states, you now had 50 different programs. So the federal government provides the funding to the states administer it anyhow they want, right? So states can make different rules. We could take a look at Maryland, right? They have their own rules. It looked like the state of Maryland, and I don't know, don't quote me on this, but it appears that the state of Maryland links its safety net with disability. So it tries to make you a disabled person or something. And unfortunately, unemployment, which is part of something you've been paying into, it now started being administered by the state, unemployment benefits. So, for instance, where I was out of work from the federal government due to no fault of my own. In fact, there wasn't a requirement of that. But the thing is, the state and the state of Maryland, they're the ones who now determine my eligibility or my the delivery of me receiving unemployment, which I've never received. So there's some kind of welfare fraud that's been going on. I'll get into that later on. Those are the consequences. It allows the states to administer these benefits programs uh, uh, in a fraudulent manner and using, uh, racial, uh, with a racial agenda in mind. Because remember, the whole idea of the reform program was to address, uh, to satisfy some kind of underlying racial animus, because remember, it started with Ronald Reagan's racial dog whistle when he pointed out Linda Taylor, the welfare queen, who was milking the American people, who was using different aliases, had given birth to multiple children so she could just get fleece the American people and get a welfare check, which is not the case. So again, as I said, the program was now being administered and controlled by the states, 50 different states, and it now had a requirement that uh, recipients had to work. Recipients had to work, and they could only receive total welfare benefits, right? That's temporary assistance throughout their lives for just 5 years max, right? So it's not something so compassionate. And I'm just gonna get into talk. I want to make these videos short, more concise, but I'm gonna talk about the economic issues. I want to do the history again, how there's fluctuations in a nation's economy. Uh, it can be speculation. For instance, we recall the Great Depression that occurred. It wasn't the fault of the low income workers that caused the Great Depression. It was actually the wealthy elite who overspeculated in the stock market and caused the stock market crash. And incomes were just distributed, jobs were just decimated overnight during the Great Depression. The same thing during this financial crisis of 2008. It wasn't the working class that created the Great Recession of 2008. Even if anybody did, there's certain rights that we have as American citizens, certain rights that we have as human beings. They are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right, to which the U.S. is a signatory. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You have a right to work, a right to, adequate housing, fair working conditions, good living standards. Remember, our Constitution says to promote the general welfare, right? Some of the conditions that the working class people have had, they've been unfair and unjust, where the working class people have not had an opportunity to be able to have subsistence standard living. They've not been able to support a subsistence standard of living, just enough to even eat, right? I'm talking about subsistence level. Their wages are not sufficient to even take them home, right? There's a quip, my take home pay is not sufficient to take me home. It can't support the cost of transportation, right? So these are reasons why a civilized society has safety nets to be able to support the working class, and rather than have this cynical view about labor, about work. You know, labor work doesn't have to be exploitation. It's a community social benefit that should benefit all people. And so that there was an impact with the signing of the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. They said people, the caseload of people on welfare, on entitlement programs decreased by 60%. People receiving welfare benefits, it decreased by 60%. But what happened to them? But you find, in the statistics that amongst minorities, especially black and brown people, especially black people, poverty was not reduced. It said people went to work. Went to work doing what, right? Poverty actually increased for black Americans. They say more black women went to work, but they were working in service jobs. So we're finding that we're now living in a society where safety nets, uh, programs that help Americans promote the general welfare of Americans and secure the blessings of prosperity and liberty, so that they can actually be better, do better, secure the American dream. They're all being taken away. They're just being eradicated. They're being eroded for black people, right? Access to education, access to funding, these things that the Great Society program made available, all of them are being gradually dismantled. And it's just making life more difficult for especially minorities in America. It's like there's an onslaught, right? There's a siege on minorities again. And so this is something you learn when you study U.S. president, and you see how the policies of American presidents have affected us, and the uh, personal responsibility and Work Opportunity Act of 1996, signed into law by President Bill Clinton, had a very adverse and negative impact on black Americans. Uh, and, there was just a disproportionate impact in society. It may have caused more cases of mental illness, because if states were administering welfare programs individually, they had controls. And many states, for instance, state of Maryland, rather than give welfare benefits, they would make you, coerce you to call yourself a disabled person first of all. So maybe say you're mentally ill when you're not, so you can just secure welfare benefits. And so, especially black people, right? Especially black people. So you see a lot of people being forced to take medication, being forced to take treatment, being dehumanized, being institutionalized, just so they can be treated, they can have an opportunity for life, to live, things that they should have a right to. There are things you have a right to. You have a right to shelter, a right to food, a right to work. But because of discrimination laws, and these are things that this welfare reform did not address. It never addressed the fact that blacks are racially discriminated against in the workplace. We have laws for that, but these laws are not practical. There's no teeth to it. They don't have money. Taking a employer to court requires an attorney. Somebody who's just trying to make a living wage, cannot afford an attorney. So the Welfare Reform Act has devastated black people. I want to keep this video short. My name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents. I'll continue it. I also draw attention to color of law violation, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts, which I've been suffering in Montgomery County, Maryland. I was a victim of swatting on May 16, 2023 by Montgomery County Police in order to obstruct justice and cover up fraud in the Department of Defense and Department of the Navy, which I had reported. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.